1960s and 70s and who popularized the phrase with regard to LSD, tune in, turn on, drop out. And I know you've heard that very same introduction or some version of it 1,000 times, and no matter what you do,
3049.
if you go to Mars on a rocket ship tomorrow, still turn on, tune in, drop out. It's going to be somewhere in the first paragraph of any story about you.
Oh, you're putting the Martians down, huh?
Do you still use LSD?
I use any neurotransmitter that my brain tells me she needs to improve my life. Yes, I do.
What's the legality of that at present? Is there some way to circumvent it? Can you use it legally?
LSD is now legal in Switzerland and in Amsterdam, Holland, and it is legal in the United States for certain government-supervised, certified psychiatrists to use.
It is true, and this isn't an endorsement, it's just a statement of fact, that many biological psychiatrists, reputable at UCLA, University of South Carolina, State University of New York, many of them are very, very interested in the use of LSD as possible therapy with schizophrenia, as a source of research with regard to brain function. So in that sense, LSD is openly talked about in the educational and medical communities, right?
Sure is.
What about, however, as a recreational drug? Is it still used with anything like the frequency that it appeared to have been used in the 60s and 70s?
Well, Bob, you probably know have not been involved publicly or scientifically with LSD for maybe 15 years, so I don't know. I would be bluffing if I tried to come on here and talk about what's happening. There was a big article in the LA Times, which obviously you've read, in which demographers and sociologists and doctors say that it is probably being used as much now as it was during the 60s, but it's being used by people who know what they're doing and are using the correct kind of doses so that you never hear about it.
Yeah, their assessment was that the usual dose today is about a quarter as much as what people were using in the 60s, and therefore the incidences of bad trips are much fewer, but that they guessed that maybe nearly as many people were users of LSD now as had been in the 60s and 70s. Is it important, from your standpoint, to separate LSD from other drugs that were used at that time and are still used today? Is it in its separate category?
Well, it's not important to me. It's important to any kind of a common sense dialogue about neurotransmitters that affect the brain that we separate. There are, as you know, there are 70 receptor sites in the brain that have evolved over the millions of years. Receptor site is a little lock that is opened by a certain neurotransmitter. And any drug that works, changes your mood or your consciousness, can do that because of its opening up a receptor site. So you're hitting buttons in your brain computer that opens up new directories. So that you have cocaine, nicotine, caffeine, sugar. There are just a wide variety of plant products that affect the brain. And I've always been interested in and done a lot of research on and a lot of writing about so-called psychedelic drugs, psychedelic plants, which have been used for thousands of years by shaman and
like mescaline, peyote, in addition to acid.
Peyote, and LSD itself comes from an ergot of rye. And what we're told is that the human being evolved in which our brains have a symbiotic relationship with certain of these botanicals or plants, just like your body needs certain carbohydrates and chemicals to keep going. Your brain has to have these. And these psychedelic plants, I'm not talking about booze or cocaine. Psychedelic plants were used during a period of human evolution which is pre-Christian, pre-Muslim, pre-monotheistic. Now, the monotheistic religions are male-oriented, and they're militaristic, and they're authoritarian. Before the monotheistic religions, pagan religions worshipped life, they worshipped nature, they were very close in a tribal situation, and in that context, psychedelic plants were used.
They may have used peyote, but just as a distinction, LSD wasn't synthesized till the late 30s or early 40s, something like that,
LSD
right?
has always existed in the form of rust on an ergot of rye. Didn't you know that?
No.
That's always been around.
Could it be used effectively prior to the late 30s, early 40s? Could people access it and use it?
LSD was not as powerful because they didn't have the ways of taking the ergot and converting it. But mescaline and peyote and particularly the mushrooms have been used. Right now they're used in tribal countries. If you notice by the way, I'm not interested in drugs anymore, but out of courtesy and because I have to do it, I'm going to talk about drugs. But believe me, I got more dangerous things to talk about when we get to it. But you can't run a factory civilization in which people are expanding their consciousness. They've got to be doing their job, because in an industrial mechanical society, if you're on an assembly line, a good person is dependable, prompt, reliable, productive, and of course replaceable. If you notice in the 60s, there was a big movement against this. The basic issues of the 60s to me were individualism, look within, rediscover the old religions. And this brings us, of course, to other aspects of the 60s culture, the counterculture, the concern with ecology, because that's a pagan thing. That's a pre-industrial thing where you're very aware of the relationship between the human being and the land and nature. These are almost corny platitudes, but they happen to be true.
To go to a kind of shorthand here, it was always your feeling, I'm just paraphrasing your contentions, that the use of LSD was not purely for ecstasy, it was for revelation, because it opened you up to sensory experiences that otherwise you wouldn't possibly be in line for.
It expands consciousness, yeah.
Expands consciousness. Therefore, you'd benefit from it in a sober state as well, as you reflected on what had occurred while you were tripping.
Absolutely.
And you always said that it should be done under the supervision of people who were experienced with psychedelic drugs, who guided you through the first 10 or 15 trips that you took until you understood how to monitor the experience for yourself.
And it should be used with great awe and prudence. It should be used for noble goals, to discover yourself, to get in better communion with other people, to improve your life. That was the goal.
But now, that having been said, and even if we assume for the sake of argument that ideally that would be attainable in some very controlled circumstances with educated people whose motives you could trust, of like sensibilities, even if that could be attained by that tiny slice of society, wasn't there always a great danger that by being an evangelist for this drug, that you were going to influence people who were in no position to use it prudently to do so?
Well, you're using the word evangelist, which is kind of a loaded word. I'm a scientist, and it's the duty of a scientist to make public his or her discoveries. And I was one of literally scores, even hundreds of reputable and I would even say in some cases distinguished people who were pointing this out. What none of us understood in the mid-60s, Bob, was the baby boom phenomena. We were so naive at Harvard back in the 60s that we assumed that psychedelic plants would be used at places like Harvard, ministers, doctors, psychiatrists, artists, and we were doing it in that context, and it was extremely successful. It never occurred to us that out in San Francisco, Ken Kesey and the Hells Angels and the Grateful Dead, and suddenly you had this mass pagan movement of young people, and unfortunately, many of the young people in the 60s were doing it out of peer pressure. Hey, you didn't want to be the only kid on the block that was not having this wonderful experience, and we were emphasizing preparation and knowing what you're doing, but it was simply a wave that took us all by surprise.
Even if we grant you the purest and most idealistic of motives in your own use of LSD and in supervising or aiding the use of LSD by people who you came into direct contact with, to what extent do you feel responsible for helping to popularize the notion of the use of this drug, and then it got out there and was used for foolish purposes, was used recklessly, harmed people's lives?
Yep. Number one, as this article in the LA Times pointed out over and over and over again, the dangers and the abuses of LSD have been tremendously inflated. Marijuana, LSD, and the psychedelic plants, everybody knows, they're the most benign, they're the least dangerous. So you tally up the scoreboard and you find out that LSD never produced. The thing about LSD was so powerful that someone would come home and they had a glow in their eye. They've seen God or they've danced with angels, and of course that kind of shakes people up. But actually the dangers of LSD are tremendously they've been demonized.
I guess what the criticism now, if criticism is the right word, comes down to is this. In the 60s and 70s, the drug culture was glamorized. And it was difficult to make distinctions. One drug to another, one person to another. And certainly you became a tremendous media figure. Do you feel as if, maybe not intentionally, but only through miscalculation, you misused the power you had at that time and contributed to getting a notion about drug use out there that you now regret?
Well, the notions that I put out there of care, caution, guides, noble motives, no, I stand by these totally. The fact that what authoritarian people do, particularly moralists do, they ignore something like LSD. Then when it comes along, you can't ignore it, then you trivialize it. Oh, it's nothing, it's just like that. And then they can't do that, they demonize it. So I don't accept the concept that the government can tell any adult what to do with their nervous system or their body or their sensory apparatus. The same with censorship of movies, the censorship of books. I'm just totally against any government or religious minding my business. Mind your own business. Stay out of my business.
What was your answer through the years when someone who wasn't necessarily some sort of right-wing reactionary, not necessarily an authoritarian, not necessarily antagonistic to libertarian ideas, simply said this: the benefits of acid are at best obscure. The risks...
How do you know that?
Well,
where's the ballpark? Yeah.
Some people within the medical community said that the benefits are at best obscure, and the risks, even if they've been greatly exaggerated by the media, by the police, whomever, the risks are not worth it, therefore. So why, even if one person in 10,000 would have a bad experience, why introduce the possibility?
But 900 people out of 1,000 are having wonderful experiences. They're changing their lives. They're discovering the divinity within. 10% of any group are going to mess it up, no matter what it is. Television, lovemaking, you name it, guns. You can't run a society that, what is this, some sort of a mental hospital state where the government, because one out of 1,000 people can misuse something, the rest of us can't use it? This is not very logical. And by the way, I'm an Einsteinian. I always believe in relativity. If you say something about this, you have to compare it with something else.
It's not a valid defense of LSD or any other drug to simply say that there are drugs that we wink at that are worse.
Well, by the way, I'm not defending anything here. I have nothing to defend here. Basically, you know, if people watching this program never use psychedelic plants again, I'll be happy, because then there won't be any problem, and those of us that don't understand how to use them, we can go about our business.
The New York talk show. You were a guest. Art Linkletter calls in during the show, and as many people know, Art Linkletter had a daughter who was involved with drugs. Among the drugs she was involved with, I guess, was acid. She had wound up killing herself. And his claim was that he held you and others who, in his view, had glorified the use of drugs, at least partly responsible for his daughter's death. Is that a fair synopsis of what happened?
Yeah, perhaps, though, that's ancient history, but perhaps we should tell the audience that this guy Siegel was the Mort Downey of his times. He was an in-your-face, vulgar, tough, kind of mean, harassing interviewer, not like you, who's sophisticated and very courteous. And Art Linkletter had a show called The Crazy Things That Kids Do. He'd made a living out of making fun of children, and he had a lot of trouble with his daughter. As a matter of fact, I didn't know his daughter, but she was a very nice person. And
in fairness to him, he seemed to get laughs with children in a loving way. I don't think he was mocking them. I think he appreciated them, and they reacted well to him because there must have been something within him that made them feel at ease.
I have tremendous sympathy for Art Linkletter to be in that position, and I know he was expressing his grief and his sorrow and his despair over the worst thing that can happen to you is to have a daughter kill herself, believe me.
You've had the same experience.
I've had the same experience, so I have nothing but compassion in my heart. I should also say, maybe your viewers don't know, that Art became a very, very outspoken right-wing person and ended up in the Nixon White House as an authority on drugs on the basis of this tragic experience. So that, yes, on the one hand, I had to sympathize with him deeply. On the other hand, I had to, kind of counter to bring some logic and common sense in this situation.
Dr. Timothy Leary is here. Let me ask you this question. I know that Diane died in 1970. What part did LSD play in this, in your judgment?
It played a very vital part, and it caused her to become bewildered and agonized about life and take her own life. And in
All right, I think it was you that caused
wait a
her.
minute. Dr. Leary.
Your hypocrisy.
All right, no, wait a minute.
And you're writing it. You got to the Nixon White House, didn't you? Because you became
that got to
on
do
the
with
basis of his daughter's death.
No, wait a minute.
He rides
That's an
into the Nixon-
outrage, Tim.
That's ghoulish.
Oh, stop. I will
That's
throw you off the
ghoulish.
show if you don't listen to these questions.
Well,
from it.
In your view, is there any validity at all to Art Linkletter's claim or the claim of any other parent like him where he might have said, look, I can recognize the distinctions that LSD may not directly cause the same terrible reactions as cocaine or heroin or even alcohol if misused, but in the atmosphere that existed, somebody takes LSD, they experience delusions, they think they can fly, and out the window they go.
That did not happen with her now. See, that's again rumor. She hadn't taken LSD for months before that. And I agree that anyone in public position who stands for a controversial point of view, which involves loss of life on the part of people who listen, has to face that, look in the mirror and say, yeah. Now, I want to say that my basic rival during those days was a man who I think was responsible for 50,000 deaths. That's Lyndon B. Johnson, who sent young Americans over there, drafted them, and sent them over there. The ballpark scoreboard statistics, the averages of damage done during the 60s, LSD was way, way down the list of almost negligible casualty rate.
How much personal antagonism do you face in 1991, given the overwhelming consensus now in the American mainstream that drugs are something that we just don't approve of? People don't want to make any distinctions or say, in this case or in that case. They just don't approve of them. How much personal antagonism do you face?
Well, first let me say, as I said before in this program, I don't talk about drugs. I give 40 college lectures a year, and I do about 20 workshops, and it's all computers, so it's only on talk shows.
And the subject doesn't come up in the audience or anything?
Yeah, during the question and answers, there'll be questions. But I want to tell you, the college students today are so bored, and they're so apathetic, and they feel cheated, that I've never been more popular on college campuses. I mean it's sold out time after time because they're hungry for someone who'll stand up and be irreverent and make them laugh at the establishment. So, and I've never faced any personal, in the 30 years that I've been out there as a dissident philosopher, making fun of religion and politics, there's only one occasion where anyone's ever personally kind of put me down in public.
And when was that?
That was in a Folsom prison, when I complained to a guard about something he was doing. It's the only time I complained, but I'm basically, I don't come to have fights with people, and I try to keep a tolerant point of view, and people don't get in my face very much.
Residue of the culture of the 60s. What has permeated the mainstream society and stuck in some way? I'm not talking about individuals who may have benefited, but for the mass culture, what's stuck?
Well, I think there are basic notions here of irreverence, and the young people didn't stop a war. But listen, the 60s movement with its symbols and its purposes and its techniques is still going on. Just last week in Yugoslavia, within Belgrade, thousands of students and young people were protesting the communist government, and they were using quote-unquote 60s slogans and 60s signs of that happened in Tiananmen Square, that sense of young people getting together. You know that Havel, the president of Czechoslovakia, was quoting Bob Dylan and John Lennon, not Vladimir Lenin, so that the movement of the 60s, which is a classic Renaissance movement, left America, clamped down here. Nancy Reagan came in, but it's still out there. Right now in Tokyo, there's a whole 60s type movement going. The young Japanese are called Shinjinrui. I've been to Japan 3 times in the last year, and I'm going back again in August. My books are being published there. The young Japanese, called Shinjinrui, that means new breed. You know what they want? They are consumer driven. They want to have, of course, they want to dress up well. They're very much disrespect for authority. Japanese kids disrespecting authority. They ain't going to work on Mitsubishi's farm no more. Tremendous openness to Western culture. They know more about... In Tokyo, there's signs say hip-hop rock, punk rock, rap. I mean, they have more varieties of Western culture. The point I'm making here is that these waves of awakening and freedom, which we in this country experienced in the 60s, it's happening all the time. It moves around, and they're always followed by restrictions, but and it's necessary. You have to kick out and then draw back.
Accommodations furnished by the Universal City Hilton and Towers. Make your next stay in Los Angeles a memorable one with our spacious rooms, international cuisine, and the attention of a friendly, experienced staff.
That concludes this session with Timothy Leary. He is back next time with some specific anecdotes from some of the strange days of the 60s and 70s and what he's up to at present. We'll get to that next time. Until then, see you later.